Welcome everybody. Are you ready to geek out over some data and some pictures and maybe some real-time discovery? Well, let's get going. We're going to be looking at some consensus data taken from a host of radiation oncologists from around the world. This is part of the C3RO project. So we're using a population of radiation oncologists. I think for this particular study, we got on the order of 70 physicians to submit contours blindly. This is for a head and neck, and I'm just going to focus on the organs at risk today. Here's what I think we're going to do. We're going to go through the following organs: the brainstem, the left and right parotid, left and right submandibular gland, larynx, and then the pharyngeal constrictor muscles all merged together. We're going to go through one by one, and we'll do, I think, the following things. And I'm going to try to move it along because I know there's a lot to cover. First, we're going to go structure by structure, and we're going to look at a very coarse look at variation. We're just going to look at histograms of the volume. So different people's opinions of how big the structure was. So we'll look at first volume histograms. Second, we're going to look at the consensus gradient index. So I think we're going to go with the ratio of where 20% of the people thought it was, so a larger agreement cloud, divided by the volume of what 80% of what people thought it was. So that's higher consensus. So again, as I explained in a prior video, you can look for it. I kind of go through the methods of how we study consensus. So we go through it there. The closer that number is to 1, the less variable it is, and the higher it is, the more variable it is, just like a dose gradient index. Then while we're looking at those pictures, we're gonna kind of just move around through 3 dimensions in the image set, and we're gonna comment on where are there regions of agreement and where are there regions of disagreement, just qualitative. By the way, all the data I'll be showing today, any of you who are C3RO participants can log in and actually interactively go through the results yourself, because we've posted the consensus grids online in the read-only results workspace. So if you're a Prono user, you know what I'm talking about. And then what I think we'll do before we move on, this will be interesting, and this is kind of to tee us up for the next few podcasts I'm going to do, which is going to be to meet with an AI vendor one at a time and look at their AI auto-segmentation engine results versus the population consensus, and see if there's some kind of level of consensus that starts to look like what an AI engine would generate. So we're going to emulate that, but we're going to use 1 or 2 of the experts, the expert physicians who were part of the panel. We're going to use their contours just as a model for that, and that might turn up some interesting things there as well. I would like to also say the interviews with the physician experts are posted on the C3RO YouTube channel. So go over there. We've got a channel over there, C3RO, and I think the targets and the organs at risk are both a different podcast. So a lot of stuff to go through there. This is to supplement, so we're kind of mining through the data. Then before we'll go through all the organs, and then before we're done, we'll kind of step back and take a look and say, of these particular organs at risk, what was the most variable, and we'll rank them from most variable to least variable or most consistent. So that'll be interesting to see. But in your head, try to predict. You can have a little contest with yourself. Rank these organs on how you think they will be, which ones will be most variable, and rank them to least variable or most consistent. And again, we're doing brainstem, left parotid, right parotid, left submandibular gland, right submandibular gland. I will say the right submandibular gland in this patient was in kind of the invaded target region, so it will probably look different than the left one, which was the contralateral. Larynx and pharyngeal constrictor. So think about what do you think is most and least variable and everything in between, and then by the end of this meeting, we'll have some numbers to put on it. All right, so let's do it. Okay, the software application I'll be using is just an application that I developed, a research application. It's pretty useful, got a lot of handy tools. If anybody wants a copy to do research, if you see anything you like, you can just let me know. Go to canuslupusllc.com. It's freeware for the people who are doing research, so you can let me know. We're going to do the brainstem first. All right, what we're looking at here is the consensus and the experts. I will turn all the experts off, all the contours off except the experts. So first thing we might want to do, zoom in a little bit. And actually, let's just look at the consensus first. But before we do anything, let's look at the volume distribution. So just how big or small people thought this was. All right, so here's a histogram. We had, in this particular case, 69 entries. Now this is kind of cool. It looks very Gaussian. We do have tails on it. So some outliers that are very large and some outliers that are small. But if you look at the middle, the quartile, 25% to median to 75%, that's actually pretty tight. 23 to roughly 29 cubic centimeters, with the median being 26 and the mean 26. So this looks, just looking at the absolute volumes, there are a lot of outliers, but the central two quartiles look pretty tight. So that's encouraging. Now let's look at the consensus dose. I think what we'll do is, so this, it looks like a dose cloud. Isodose lines here are ISO agreement lines. I think what might be interesting for the brainstem is to look in sagittal, because there is, immediately our eyes are drawn to the regions of agreement. So regions of agreement clearly in this central red region. And then when you see these steep gradients, as I explained in the other video, that's a region of agreement too, where people are agreeing on the surface. So we've got the anterior surface, there's a lot of agreement. Now we do start to see a good amount, or regions of disagreement, inferior, where we see it spread out, and superior, where we also see it spread out. And then we have less agreement on the posterior side than we do on the anterior side. But otherwise, these are pretty tight gradients. If we want to look at the coronal there, again, laterally, high agreement. So that's kind of an interesting picture. You get to learn how to read these things. It's kind of neat. Now, to study the contours of individuals, of an expert versus the consensus, we'll put it back in axial. But before we do that, let's calculate the consensus gradient index, 20% agreement divided by 80% agreement. So I'm going to go here. So I'm just got these dose metrics, and I'm going to treat it like a dose. And we're going to use the gradient index. So it's just the volume of one dose level or agreement level divided by another. And we're going to go from 20% to 80%. Looks good. And the value, dun, 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 is 2.047. So I'm going to jot this down. So roughly twice the volume when we're at 20% consensus versus a high agreement of 80% consensus. Let's go back to the view. By the way, pretty interesting view here is if we look at the DVH and we turn the experts on, instead of being a dose volume histogram, it's a consensus volume histogram. This is kind of a neat thing to look at, ideally for a perfectly agreeing contour versus a consensus that was completely in agreement. This would look like a step function. But we can start to learn how to interpret these as well. And maybe we'll do that over time, but not today. So here are the consensus contours. Let's pick, I tell you what, in today's session, again, what I'm doing is I'm going to set up the model that I'm going to use for looking at AI generated contours, but we're going to use an expert today. And because I've known him for a good time and just totally respect how much Jimmy Caudell from Moffitt was one of the experts in the panel. And when it comes to head and neck contouring, he is intense and very good teacher. And since I know Jimmy, I'm going to pick on him and because he probably wouldn't mind. So you see, there is his contour, and you see it kind of lining up. So that big thick line there is his contour. If we want to look in another view. So there is agreement. He's definitely going larger in the superior direction like a lot of people did, but not everybody. Well, I have this little tool where I can find what's the consensus line that most agrees with this expert and with what quantified values. So what I do is for this particular case, 62.9% it says dose, but of course it's a consensus line. So 62%, and it has a pretty high agreement. Dice coefficient there is 0.913. That's pretty high. Confirmation number, which is a little more sensitive than the dice, is 0.837. So I might jot that down, 62.9 with a dice of 0.913. So that's starting to show that there is a consensus level in there that starts to look high agreement with at least one of the experts. Now we could do this with any of the experts, or you could do it with any single contours. So that's on the brainstem. Now we'll go on to our next structure. So I'm going to load now the left parotid. All right, we're getting now the consensus view. Let me navigate to the middle. Zoom it up. Now we're not really focusing on what's right or wrong. We're just looking at where the variation is and where the agreement is. So immediately we see something if we look over in the sagittal or the coronal. Let me pop the coronal up. So now we're looking on FAS. We have a much smaller region of complete agreement, but there is this region of agreement in the red down here. That's the volume that everyone thought was part of the left parotid. And then we have high agreement on the edge near the patient's surface. That's not surprising. But then we see a very large region of disagreement in basically all the other directions, especially superior and then inwards toward the body. So you kind of get the idea here that this is certainly not as consistent as the brainstem was. That's not necessarily surprising. Let's do our calculations. This particular gradient index, that's the volume of 20 divided by the volume of 80 here is 1.952. So actually slightly more consistent in terms of the gradient index than the brainstem was. That's a little surprising. Well, you know what it is? It's because we have a small region where 100% agreed, but the region where 80% agreed, that's right here, and that's actually pretty consistent. So we had some outliers that drew it very small, but then we did start to see more agreement when we're drawing it larger. So that's an interesting thing that we can start to interpret. All right, I forgot to show you the volume histogram. Let me pop that open. Again, we can look and see here are some outliers that are very small in volume. The range of 9 cubic centimeters all the way up to 41 cubic centimeters is a pretty large range. See some outliers that were smaller than most people. And here we see roughly 25 cubic centimeters to 35 with a median at 30. So that central portion, there's pretty good agreement, and that makes some kind of sense as we look and see these edges. So again, let's bring up Dr. Caudell's structure, just as an example of one instance versus a population. So we're looking at the left parotid. All right, now this is interesting. So you can see there was definitely an art form that Dr. Caudell used. Definitely spending some time drawing different shapes. If we just look at the contours, you can see. And of course, he was one of the panelists in the C3RO video, so I encourage you to go watch that. So you can see that's a complex shape, and that's a complexity that's not necessarily shown in the consensus. But let's do our same calculation and look and see, is there a consensus line that's got decent agreement? Max agreement here is 38.1%. Jotting that down. With a dice of 0.868. So DICE is a measure of overlap. It won't tell you where they're different, how far they're different. Just for kicks here, let's pick John. John was one of the experts. Now this is interesting. So he didn't have that he differs from Jimmy a little bit there in some of that structure. This starts to look more like, I don't know, maybe the 20-30% line. Let's see what level of agreement we have with this expert. Okay, it's higher. It's at 24% of the population. So people who are drawing it larger are looking more like the experts so far. And a DICE of 0.906. So that's pretty high. So now a question is, if we turn all the left parotids on and we turn the consensus off, here we see the difference of opinion from the experts. So this is part of the challenge, right? If we get, in this case, 5 different experts, they have 5 opinions and they don't overlap completely. Now they do match fairly well. So if we looked at a consensus of this, it would be much tighter gradients around. But again, let's turn the population back on. And, you know, the population of experts starts to really looks like the population of the larger population of all the participants. So the experts are agreeing with some of the lower consensus lines, so the larger structure. We should see similar results for the right parotid. So let's load that and I'll go through it really quickly. All right, let's turn all the structures off. We'll turn the right parotid experts on. We need to go over here and voila. Again, if we want to look real quick, and you can do all of this in Prono, the same consensus lines and contours you can turn on, off, just a little bit different interface. So those are the expert lines. Here's the consensus. Let's pick one of our experts. Let's go with Dr. Caudell again, and figure out what and kind of look through, except for some of the, kind of really carefully drawn part here that the population didn't do. There does seem to be a high degree of overlap towards those lower consensus lines. And here we have a 42.9 for is the level of consensus max for the right parotid, which is really similar to what Dr. Caudell had for the left parotid. It was 38.1. So the same trend we're seeing, and that's kind of important. That should be expected. We shouldn't see a big difference left and right in this particular case. Let's look at the volume histogram. I keep forgetting to do that. Right parotid looks a lot like the left parotid. So again, remember we had 30 to 35, the quartile range. Here it's 30 to 37, median about 34. I think the other one was sorry, I think we had 30 to 40 on the other one with median 35. So very similar. Again, not surprising given these are just bilateral structures. Again, we see some outliers there in the small. And now let's look at the regions of agreement and disagreement. Probably going to be similar trends to what we saw earlier. One little artifact here you can see in the sagittal, it looks like someone didn't complete their contours or forgot to interpolate because there's missing slices in there. So really we just pay attention to the orange. 90%, we can not worry about the 100% that's going to be sensitive to errors like that. This is very interesting. I mean, these gradients are following pretty well in this view, except we do start to see differences as we move inward. So there's a big region of disagreement where my mouse is. Very big, very high agreement, obviously here at the edge and in this belly of it, but a lot of disagreement. This big spread out region indicates a disagreement. And if I look at the coronal view, you can see it from a different view. So when you see it balloon out like that, that's where we need to figure out, well, what's right, what's wrong. Now in this particular case, our experts really by and large, turn them on again, are taking the perspective of the large, of incorporating this region of disagreement, incorporating it all. So if I turn that on and we look, say, at Jimmy and John, you can see they're definitely thinking this region of disagreement, they would probably teach, or they would say, I contour that volume. So let's find out. 42.9, we did that already. Let's do John. Yeah, 32.9. So again, showing consistency left to right. So that's the right parotid. All right. One thing we forgot to look at that we're going to need is what's that gradient index? 1.802. That's interesting. That is lower. The one on the right parotid has less variation than the left parotid. And I'm not sure why that would be. I'm sure the physicians might have some theories. Maybe that they should talk about that. It's kind of interesting. Move on to the submandibular glands. Now, we are on the right side, so I'll stay on this side of the patient. This is where I think the side with the GTV was, if I remember. So the right and the left submandibular gland will probably not be the same volumes. Let me load the consensus. It's a lot of structures to get through. It's really, you really want to dive in deep on this. And so I think some of the consensus studies almost should do little sets of structures together so we could really think about them and have more time to discuss them. But we're moving along pretty well. All right, let's go find this. Get it. Oh, now this is interesting. If we look at the sagittal view here, again, let's kind of examine qualitatively. Good agreement here on these edges, the inferior edge, and everyone agreed on this small volume, but then it started to be a lot of disagreement on how far up does the right submandibular gland go. So if we look at there's a 2.57 is the gradient index, so it's definitely more variable than the right parotid. So the right submandibular has a 2.570. Kind of go through again, and yeah, that seems like the biggest region of disagreement. It's a large region of disagreement, and it's in this direction. So this is the area we should be talking about. Let's take a look at our experts. Let's turn them all on. And there are a couple slices of big disagreement between the experts here, these greenish lines. So again, just for consistency's sake, now this technique I'm doing to find where does the consensus most match the expert, you can do that with any set of expert contours. I'm just trying to be consistent and choose one. Now that's a high dice, 0.907, and it's at an ISO agreement or a consensus level of 35%. So that's a pretty large region of overlap there. And again, at the 35% level, pretty similar to the agreement level where Jimmy was matching on the parotid. So that's kind of maybe interesting. Let's see if that happens on the left as well. But before we move on, let's look at just the volume, the size that people thought here. Okay, more outliers, both large and small. The quartiles, the two interquartiles, not bad, 8.5 cubic centimeters to 11.77. When I say not bad, I mean pretty consistent. So there are 50% of the people here are huddled in these bands. And then we have much bigger bands where there start to be some different opinions. In this case, I think the experts are going to trend more towards this larger size. So that's an interesting thing. Now, keep this in mind. This was let's say the median was 10 cubic centimeters. We'll kind of keep that in mind as we compare it to the left side. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's load up the left. All right, here's the consensus. Let me get in the middle of it. Well, now this seems to be more consistent than the last one. This looks quite consistent. Well, relatively consistent. If we look at the coronal here, so this is the left submandibular gland. That's very interesting. This may be competing to be one of the more consistent structures. Let's kind of do a flyby. This is the population. Let's turn the experts on. They're pretty consistent as well. Let me turn the consensus. So start to differ there at the superior edge, but otherwise they start to merge, and then down at that, pretty good agreement at the bottom. So I'm real curious here. It seems to me that we've got a pretty consistent, if we go to the metric analysis there, 1.747. Sure enough, so that's the lowest one so far, 1.747. Compared to, now, this is really interesting. Compare that to the right submandibular gland, which had a gradient index of 2.57, meaning the right was much more variable than the left. And I think that's to be expected too when we consider there was tumor over there that made contouring a little even more of an art than it already is. Let's take a look at Dr. Caudell's contour. Oops. Turn the right one on. And let's see. Look at there. His, again, near 30, max agreement was with the population, about 35% of the population, with an exceptionally high dice of 0.394 or 0.934. That's our highest yet. So if we look at this, an individual versus a consensus, we saw something similar. High degree of matching for this expert at the 35% level of the consensus. And this is one of the things that might be interesting is, can we kind of reproduce an expert when we take the wisdom of the crowd? And if so, then you can start to plan some interesting things with that. Let's look at the volumes. I apologize if I seem a little excited about this stuff. I know maybe it's boring to some of you, but it's data, and we need to look at these data and we need to learn from it, because getting consistent contouring is really important. All right. It looks here roughly the same size as the right submandibular gland, but much less variable. Okay, these are outliers, very small drawn, and then some larger ones. But this narrow band from 8.5 to 10 is narrower. So clearly, and as we've proven with a few metrics now, the left submandibular gland, or the contralateral submandibular gland, there's much less variation than the ipsilateral submandibular gland. All right, we're going to see something here where we might expect to see more variation. I got a little peek at the data earlier, so we're going to do the larynx. Let's zoom out and try to figure out what's going on here. Pan around. Kind of get into the middle. All right. So clearly you can see, let me put the coronal. This is what a highly variable set of opinions look like. Very little red and orange and a lot of everything else. So before we do anything else, let's get the metric. This is a metric of volumetric variation, or the gradient index, 4.231. Not surprising, very high. While we're looking at just kind of variation, let's look at the histogram of volumes. Okay, that's a wide spread. So if we just look, the minimum that someone drew was 4.9. So that's one person's opinion is less than 5 cubic centimeters. The max was 90. That is a huge range. I'm not sure. So yeah, this is the larynx. So some people may be doing interpretation, but I think the instructions given were probably pretty specific as to the protocol to follow. So that's a large range of opinions. And then even the range of the 25% to the 75% quartile, 22 cubic centimeters to 45, that's a big range. So we have a highly variable structure when it comes to contouring. Let's see how our experts looked here. I'm kind of curious to see if they're as different as the population is. Yeah, pretty different. If we go slice by slice, I'll start at the bottom. I'm sorry, I'll start, let me get to the bottom here. Don't want to fly through. There's a sagittal view. So yeah, some differences opinions on the inferior border. Let's go down to the very edge and kind of work our way up slice by slice. So this is one person's contour, and then other people start to come in. And then, you know, we see different shapes. So these are different techniques. And so there's a question here. Did people read the instructions? Were the instructions specific enough? Or are the instructions open to interpretation? And that's a pretty good question, because that's what happens in the real world. So if people are comparing DVHs for the larynx, but they're drawing it with vastly different strategies, then we've not got the best designed experiment, then, do we? Let's take a look and see if we have any high agreement here. Let me turn all these experts off, except for, again, Jimmy. Now this will be interesting, because there is a trend. Oh, let's do our magic. Calculate. Okay, so what we're looking at here, the 57% of the population is the max agreement with this expert. The dice and the confirmation number are much lower than all the other ones. So again, this indicates that the population got a lot of variation in it and not necessarily mapping to this particular expert. Let's try another expert. Let's try John. And that's even a lower. So the max dice we can have is 0.5 at a level of the consensus. Let's try another one, Dr. Brower. See if any of these are high. No, 0.5. This, I'm not sure who. Now this is a high. Okay, we're going to come back to this one. Let me do Dr. Fuller real quick. Okay. Oops. That was the same one. I got to highlight. So these two experts do have a high matching with the consensus levels at 30%. And in this case, yeah, in the 30s. Look at this dice coefficient, 0.856. So this expert X, I don't know who that was, but it's real interesting. It does start to look like a portion of an ISO agreement line of the population. So again, I think the larynx there should really move up the list in terms of what physicians get together and talk about, and hopefully drive out variation. Because just by looking here at the sagittal view, that's a very spread out consensus, and that means there's a lot of variation. A lot of region. I mean, the region of agreement here is basically limited to a couple of the edges and in the very center of it. Other than that, everything is high disagreement. Last but not least, the constrictor muscles, pharyngeal constrictor muscles. This could be an adventure. Again, all the physicians were given the same image set, the same instructions. I think the instructions were designed by the physician planning group with C3RO. So kind of like the real world. Pretty picture. Let's go through the axial and let's Let's do a fly through of this. I'm going to start at the bottom. Whoops. Start at the bottom here, and I'm going to go up. We're looking now at the population. So no red yet. So there's a lot of people who didn't contour down this far. Generally, the volume is co-located. That's good, but there's, yeah, so that's the population. Let's turn the experts on. Let's turn the population off. Turn the experts on. Now you can really start to see, okay, we got a lot of variation in the experts. This would be a small sample size, so there might have been, if we had seen the 70-some individual contours of the population, it probably would have looked all over the place too. Of course, the wisdom of the crowd smooths it out, but we're seeing a lot of variation. So again, I'll refer you back to the podcast on the C3RO channel, and you hear people talk about what they did and why. But let's do our magic. 21. So the gradient index here is 21, meaning, of course, the volume of 20% agreement is 21 times bigger than the volume of 80% agreement. So extremely high variation. Let's do the histogram of volumes. Minimum of 2 cubic centimeters, max of 33. The quartile at 25% is 12.19, 75% 21 with a median of 17. So what you see here is the tails aren't as small relative. So the whole curve here, we have 53. So some people didn't contour this at all. This is flatter, meaning it's higher variation. The standard deviation relative to the mean here is pretty high. So the coefficient of variation is pretty high just looking at the size that people thought it was. That's not even looking at overlap. Here's the overlap, and then we got that 21 ratio, indicates extremely highly variable. It's hard to even look at these pictures because basically the whole volume is a region of disagreement, but you see slices like this, and it's promising to see, you know, you see the muscle and you start to get some consistency. I think if we look at the sagittal view, what we see here is that it's just so spread out. This is basically a huge tail of disagreement. So people are starting at different places and stopping at different places. That would be the main source of variation. And again, I do think if people talk about it and set some rules and expectations, then we can start having more consistent contouring, which is going to lead to more consistent dosimetric, DVH objectives that people are marching towards, and then hopefully then the clinical trials and outcomes will be more reliable. All right, so now the moment of truth. Let's do a rundown of kind of the metrics of variation. Oh, well, one thing we didn't do was see what the level of agreement is for this particular structure. So the max dice coefficient with any of the consensus lines here is less than 0.7, so 0.682 for Dr. Caudell. Let's go with our expert X again, 0.67. Yeah, so we're not going to get real high agreement with the population, and that's going to happen when the variation is so high. There's even a lower one. The max agreement there is 0.366. So we got some work to do on all of these structures, really, but in particular, well, actually now let's rank them by variation. So let me build a table, and I'll be right back. All right, here is the tally from most variable to most consistent or least variable. Most variable by a mile are the pharyngeal constrictors. Next, also quite variable, the larynx. The ipsilateral submandibular gland was next on the list, which is really interesting in comparison to the fact that the most consistent across the population here was the left submandibular gland. So I think it definitely had to do with the invasion of the disease. Brainstem, then the two parotids very close to each other. Yeah, so if those were your guesses or the trend, then you guessed it. Now, all of them probably need a little work. When we looked at those consensus clouds, there were regions of disagreement in all of them, some more than others. And so there we go. It kind of sets our sights on what we should be talking about and where in the body. And yeah, I hope this was useful. So there you have it. Now, this was a little bit of a primer. The same data set and the consensus will be now, we'll use them in 3 interviews independently done with 3 volunteering AI vendors. Those, I will try to get all those interviews done next week and release them all at the same time, so none of them will have seen each other's results before. Of course, they're not going to say if they're right or wrong, but I think looking at an AI auto-segmentation versus a population and consensus, or even we can maybe compare it to the experts, be a really neat exercise. And also, we just want to start asking the AI vendors, what are their methods of validating their software? How do they work with their customers to determine what's right? And how do they do the comparisons? It's going to be real interesting, and hopefully we'll find some reason for these consensus studies to provide some wisdom that'll help AI vendors learn and do a better job at validation. So look for those podcasts next. Thanks for joining.